There have been increasing concerns around Huawei, and these are not new. So concerns around Huawei have existed for at least the past decade or so.
And of course, you have those on the other side pushing back, saying, there's no goddamn way I'm allowing the Communist government of People's Republic of China to dominate our 5G network.
Because we're an academic research laboratory, that means that we have to be able to cite every single thing in fact. So if I say something, I need to be able to walk it back to someone.
This is Phil Gurski, President and CEO of Borealis Threat Risk Consulting in Russell, Ontario, Canada. And you're listening to Canadian Intelligence, a podcast about national security and public safety. So you know that I worked in national security for more than 3 decades. I worked in SIGINT, signals intelligence. I worked in human intelligence, and had access to a ton of information on a daily basis to do whatever small part I could to help keep Canada safe. Now that I'm no longer part of the national security world, at least not technically, I still kind of put my foot in here and there. The one thing I find really interesting, and one thing I don't have a good understanding of, is what are the threats out there when it comes to information and stealing of information and posting of fake information. I then decided that I needed to bring someone in to the podcast who knows a heck of a lot more about this than I do. His name is Chris Parsons. He's a senior research associate with the Citizen Lab in Toronto. And just a bit of an intro, the Citizen Lab is an interdisciplinary laboratory based at the Munk School of Global Affairs at the University of Toronto, which focuses on research, development, and high-level strategic policy and legal engagement at the intersection of information and communication technologies, human rights, and global security. So, Chris, I appreciate you being here today.
Thanks so much for having me.
How long have you been with the Citizen Lab, Chris? And can you sort of, aside from that short introduction idea, can you help my listeners understand what the Citizen Lab is and exactly what it does?
Yeah, sure. So I joined the lab a little over 7 years ago now. So I first came as a postdoctoral fellow, and since have become a regular staff member as a research associate and now a senior research associate. So the Citizen Lab, as you mentioned, is an interdisciplinary research lab. And so that means that we bring together computer scientists, computer engineers, sociologists, lawyers, political scientists, philosophers, communications experts, really the full gamut of what you can find in academia. We have working with us, if not at all times, on an ongoing basis. And the lab is perhaps best thought of as a collection of interrelated teams. So we work closely with one another, but we've sort of broken things down into a series of different issue areas. So just to begin, we have a threat intelligence team, which is fairly prominently known, and indeed is one of the reasons why a lot of people know the Citizen Lab of late. And so that team is involved in identifying targeted attacks against civil society and human rights defenders, and then chasing down who is behind or responsible for those threats. And in addition to sort of doing reversing of malware and things like that, they also do an awful lot of work doing sensor analysis of the internet to identify infrastructure based on signatures that we tend to have developed in-house. And so that's headed up by one of my colleagues, John Scott Railton. And for the past couple of years, some of the most prominent work that they've done has focused on an Israeli malware company called NSO Group, which develops and sells very sophisticated malware to state-level governments that tend to have pretty poor human rights records. There's another team that is principally involved in doing censorship monitoring across the internet, along with our partners at other universities and institutions. So they're really trying to understand what are the gateways on the internet that are filtering or blocking content, what content is being blocked, and then at the social science level, trying to understand why that content may be blocked. Both from a legal perspective, but also from just doing regional studies to understand, why is something being blocked in Indonesia or in the MENA region or something like that. We have another team that does, again, software reverse engineering, but that team focuses almost exclusively on China-related censorship and filtering. So some of the work that they've done has looked at how different browsers collect and manage information for surveillance purposes. They've also done work on Chinese social media applications such as WeChat to understand not just how that company is compelled to build its products to engage in surveillance of Chinese individuals within China, but indeed at least as of about a year ago, they were engaged in surveillance of all of their users' content, even if they were abroad. And then they used that surveillance information to build up censorship indices that were then applied to individuals within China or with China built or China registered accounts. We do a little bit of other stuff around misinformation. And then there's this stuff that I do, which is a little different from all of it.
Wow. And now we get to your stuff finally.
So I liaise with all the other teams with a regular basis, and I do principally legal and policy work. So I sit at the intersection of technology, law, and policy, and a lot of my job is actually communicating to all of those stakeholder groups what is going on. Why is a technical issue matter to lawyers? Why is a legal issue matter to policymakers? And why is a policy coming down the line that's going to make technologists' lives hell?
Okay, wow, that's an amazing amount of activity that the lab is involved in. I can't help but pick up on one thing you said, Chris, and you talked about China and Chinese state actors. I've had the privilege and the sadness, actually, of meeting with a couple of Uyghur Canadians who have, in fact, been assaulted. Is too strong a word, or maybe not. They've definitely been threatened, both online and offline, for speaking out against what's happening, what China is doing to the Uyghur population in Xinjiang province. So those types of activities would really fall definitely within the bailiwick of what Citizen Lab is trying to inform us about.
Definitely in the sense of the digital realm. So we focus, in that space. So we're not really spending a whole lot of time doing analyses of the human-based threats that individuals are faced. We're obviously aware of them through news reports. But when it comes to some of the communities that the Chinese government or operatives associated with Chinese government are harassing, we'll be looking at stuff like in northern India, as an example, where for a long time ongoing malware campaigns have been launched against the Tibetan and exile community. And so trying to understand what exactly is being used to target them, why are they being targeted, what are the implications of that targeting, and then providing in some cases assistance or suggestions as to how that community can improve its digital security hygiene.
Okay. Let's stick with China for a second, Chris. I read something you recently wrote, and I'll quote here. Canada does not have a Huawei problem per se. Instead, Canada has a 5G strategy problem that is linked to the government of Canada lacking a principle driven set of integrated industrial, cybersecurity, and foreign policy strategies that directly and meaningful address the challenges raised by the current and expected 5G landscape. So, for those who don't follow this, of course, Canada is caught up in a very, very messy dispute right now with China. Almost 2 years ago to the day, we arrested in British Columbia. Was it Meng Wanzhou, I believe her name is? She's the chief financial officer of Huawei at the behest of the Americans. And the Chinese arrested two Canadians who they've held basically incommunicado for the past 2 years. So we're not getting along with China right now, especially on that file. But when you said that Canada rather, doesn't have a Huawei problem, but a 5G strategy problem, what did you mean by that?
Yeah, so in Canada, but around the world, there have been increasing concerns around Huawei, and these are not new. So concerns around Huawei have existed for at least the past decade or so, along with other Chinese companies such as ZTE, which is another prominent telecommunications vendor.
Hmm.
Um, and so what? So there's a little bit going on. So in the West, we have seen a reduction in research and development, and frankly, companies like Sony and Ericsson are a little bit behind Huawei's competitor in the 5G space. At the
Hmm.
same time, during the 2008 financial collapse in Canada, there was basically a decision by the Canadian government: do we bail out the automakers or do we bail out Nortel? There's a choice to bail out the automakers as opposed to Nortel, and so that major strategic competitor is gone. So what this means is Huawei has a competitive advantage at the moment. And that has a
Right.
whole lot of countries really concerned because the worry is that if the initial investments in 5G technologies are Huawei based products, that's likely going to mean that subsequent investments will also have to be Huawei investments because of vendor lock in and issues like that.
Right.
And
Once you
so,
start with them, you got to continue with them essentially.
yeah, and there's a whole bunch of reasons for that, but that's exactly it. So, what we've seen is a large amount of concern, sometimes vitriolic concern, that China is basically Huawei and Huawei is China, and therefore we need to address Huawei, and as a result, our 5G security issues are going to be solved. I disagree with that. I think that what needs to be done instead is, given that we are at a phase, we're really talking about critical infrastructure at this point, next generation telecommunications information and systems that has the potential to substantively modify the way that industrial practices work, cybersecurity has to be conceptualized. We're at a point where we can either just keep assuming that Western companies are all secure. I would note they're not, and that Chinese companies are not. Or we can say we need a vendor neutral approach. We should subject all critical infrastructure providers to an equivalent high level of scrutiny given the importance of this infrastructure. And thus, if we just focus on Huawei, and whether we permit or we partially permit or ban Huawei, and we sort of ignore that broader part of the debate, we actually are missing the real debate. And the real debate is, how do we ensure that Canadians have a trusted, reliable, and well serviced critical infrastructure, not where is it produced? Is it produced in Finland or is it produced in China? That's just not really the way to think about security.
But in essence, it really was our own fault. As you said, way back in the financial crisis of the late 2000s, the government opted to bail out the auto sector and not Nortel, and therefore Nortel has now gone the way of the dodo.
Yeah, I mean, we are, enjoying the consequences of that, and indeed, and I just want to point out, Huawei has done nothing wrong in what I'm about to say. Huawei went, and when they saw all of these Nortel engineers who are top in class, some of the best in the world, they said, "Oh, well, we will hire all of you." And
Hmm.
so, if you look at, Huawei's very excellent research and development lab, who do you see leading it? A whole bunch of Nortel scientists that
Right,
were really at the peak of their game then, and they still are now.
right. Now, when you talk about, Chris, about having a regime in place to vet, regardless of where the vendor's from, whether it's Huawei, and I think there are issues. I agree with you. I think some of the dialogue about Huawei and China, China Huawei, is a bit vitriolic, but there is some there. Same thing with Nokia, same with Ericsson. They're not Canadian; they're foreign firms, albeit Western firms. When you say we want to create a system to be able to vet these sellers, these vendors, in such a way that Canada is getting not only a good value for its money, but it's a secure value. How would that happen, and who would be responsible for that whole process?
Yeah, so right now there's a few processes in Canada that is used to assess some equipment. So first, there's a security review program. So this is a process whereby some telecommunications equipment is assessed, and then the results are piped back to the CSE, that provides some sort of assurance that what is being sold in the Canadian networks is secure. Um, that's pretty cloak and dagger at the moment, to be honest, which is very frustrating.
Mhm.
Neither CSC nor telecommunications providers tend to be very open or transparent about what's actually going on there. There's also something that's
Chris, I worked at CSE for 17 and a half years. I know exactly what you're talking about.
um, and then we participate in something called Common Criteria right now, which is Canada accredits a bunch of research laboratories. Um, who are assessing all sorts of vendors' products: Nokia, Ericsson, Samsung, Huawei, et cetera, et cetera. Now, what I'm saying is not we should rely on either of those, to be honest. Instead, we should adopt a model similar to what the United Kingdom has done. And so in the UK, what's happened is, as a result of some concerns raised by British Telecom, Huawei is now investing a bunch of money to hire a pile of employees who are then overseen by a senior member of the GCHQ. So their version of the
Oh,
CSE or the NSA.
yeah, 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 yeah.
So what happens is, this is an independent body from Huawei. So you have engineers that are then ripping apart Huawei equipment and finding vulnerabilities, finding issues, and the reports, quite frankly, for the past several years have been just damning. Fundamental baseline security practices are not being met per the UK's reports. So what does that do? It means that one of the most open source information we have about the technical deficiencies within Huawei network appliances is because of what this UK center is doing. So I'm not saying that Canada should then, build our own center and we'll look at every single company, because, there's only so many Canadians and so much
Right,
time. But
right.
rather, we could work with our Five Eyes partners. So
Hmm.
maybe Canada looks at let's say Samsung, and the UK, maybe they keep looking at Huawei because they're pretty good at looking at it, and we probably still want to know what's in it or not, regardless of whether it's permitted in our networks.
Hmm.
The US could look at Ericsson and someone else, and you can just spread out the load across the
Right.
Five Eyes. And indeed, you probably don't have to just restrict it to the Five Eyes. You could integrate it with some of our closest friends and allies in democratic countries around the world. And so we have these centers, we do these analyses, and then we share the data around with one another so we can improve the quality of all providers' equipment. And when we find deficiencies, we can then notify and explain to our domestic telcos, hey, here's some problems. Here's how we suggest you mitigate it if you don't already have the solution in place.
Oh, you're preaching to the choir here because when I worked in SIGINT, we did have agreements amongst the Five Eyes to divide up certain intelligence priorities. So why we couldn't do this for technology review, I think makes a lot of sense to me. But I do want to pick up on one thing you said, Chris, and you said that these UK reports that have looked into Huawei have uncovered all kinds of things that are vulnerabilities or weaknesses in the Huawei equipment. Now, I don't want to get all conspiracy theory here on you, but is it just kind of that's the way technology evolves? Is that you make something, you find some mistakes, you fix them, you move on? Or is there something more nefarious about the fact that Huawei has these significant vulnerabilities built into its system and it's trying to sell its equipment to the West? And of course, you have those on the other side pushing back saying, there's no goddamn way I'm allowing the communist government of People's Republic of China to dominate our 5G network. So am I reading too much into this, or is this more, this is the way technology works?
Yeah, so the front I agree with. The end of what you said isn't currently backed up by open source evidence. Let me explain what I mean by that a little bit more. So we know uh, we know that as code bases get larger and larger, accidents happen, right? So any sophisticated system, natural accidents occur, and in code, those are bugs and vulnerabilities. So
Right,
that's just sort of the way that technology operates, which is why every device we have that's being well serviced gets routine security updates and service updates on a
right.
regular basis.
Shit
Now,
happens.
yeah, and in the case of Huawei, what has been found, and so it isn't just the UK hasn't just looked at the products; they've actually gone to China and then assessed how some of the technologies have been developed. And what they found was first, absolutely no instance at any time when they've been doing their assessments did they think that, oh, this is because the Chinese government has compelled us. That has never come up. At no point
Hmm.
in the reports do they think that these vulnerabilities are the result of the Chinese government pushing vulnerabilities into products. Rather, what has been found or has been generally identified is there's a poor overall security culture within Huawei itself. And
Oh.
you can sort of think of this like Microsoft in the early 2000s.
Hmm.
Like they had to delay a bunch of their operating systems for a considerable period of time, basically because they started red teaming their own stuff
Right.
after major vulnerabilities that have been exploited worldwide. And, you know, prior to those reforms, I would say that Microsoft probably also would have been identified as having an immature security culture. And now you look at them today, and they have one of the most security cultures, one of the most mature security cultures, in the software industry. So Huawei is sort of like Microsoft pre 2000s at the moment in terms of security. So they're producing high quality products in terms of what they can technically provide, but they are problematic products in that they're also laden with vulnerabilities and just sort of poor practices in software development and hardware development.
Now, is am I going too far in saying that's just typical of companies that want to push a product out the door and don't do their due diligence in terms of red teaming and looking at their devices to detect vulnerabilities? Is this just the way things go?
I think that to some extent, Huawei has been a company that is focused first and foremost on growth and expansion. So you can almost think of them as, I mean, they're not a startup, but you can think of them as having a semi-startup mentality.
Right.
And they haven't had one of those moments where everyone sort of says, okay, we need to pause everything for a little while and reform our internal practices. Now, I will note that Huawei is committed to investing $2 billion to improve that security culture. But as of the report that came out earlier this year, there's been no evidence that, from the GCHQ's perspective, there's been no evidence that that has been substantively implemented.
Okay. So in other words, there's still some ways to go. Chris, you used an interesting phrase a minute ago. You talked about how you'd seen nothing in the open source to suggest that, in fact, the Chinese government is planning this kind of thing. I want to pick up a phrase, another one that I took from one of your reports off the website. You talk about investigations into the prevalence and impact of digital espionage operations against civil society groups. I come from the intel world, so we have our own sources, obviously a little more sensitive secret, although even we recognized by the time I finished my career in 2015 that 98% of what we were doing was open source. It was the 2% we had access to that we thought made a difference. How is it that Citizen Lab can work solely with open source information and come up with some really important findings? Is the environment that rich that you're able to mine it? And what are the challenges in just dealing with the fire hose of open source information on a daily basis?
Yeah, so no one at System Lab has top secret clearance or anything like that. So uh, we don't have any access to classified information. And more to the point, because we're an academic research laboratory, that means that we have to be able to cite every single thing in fact. So if I
Right,
say something, I need to be able to walk it back to somewhere, which is
right.
similar in the intelligence services, but it means I need to walk it back to something I can point to online and I can verify after assessing it, which means that it ends up being open source. So the lab at large, we have our own, we have our own sources and methods. Now, in our technical reports, we do discuss to the extent possible. Here's how we did what we did. Here's the processes that we go through. But obviously, we have individuals that will reach out to us and say, "Hey, there's this weird thing," and we may have a back and forth with them, and from there we'll do an assessment. Do we deploy our technical teams, do we apply our legal teams, do we apply our policy teams to go through and really like hash out what this is? And so to give you a non-technical example, right, we might have a situation where someone says, oh well, in my country of X, there's a law that's being passed that will permit the government to activate these technical devices that they've purchased, and those technical devices will facilitate, I don't know, like the blocking of certain kinds of encryption. Let's just say. So,
Mhm.
okay, what does that mean? First, we do an assessment. Do we have people internal that can actually read that language, or is Google Translate enough? Or if not that, do we have partners we can reach out to? Then we're going to go and we're going to look at the law. We're going to look at the policy. We're going to maybe see the way it's been framed in Parliament, the way the civil society groups have talked about it, how companies have talked about it, because if it's blocking encryption, they're probably going to be a little upset as well. And perhaps if the legal or policy team say, oh yeah, there's something there, we should look into this. Okay, then we might get one of the technical teams to come in and say, all right, we're going to do some surface level scans and put this country on sort of a watch list where we just automate a bunch of encrypted communications of different sorts to see if we have anomalous events. And when do we get those? Are they always happening? So are people complaining that Skype isn't working right now, but Skype has just been sort of janky for the past like 8 months or something?
Mhm.
Or is it that all of a sudden there has been a marked change in the network, and it happens to align very closely to when this piece of legislation was passed? So that would just be an example of what we're doing. Now, the Citizen Lab, we have a good bench of technical talent. We also have to comport, and we do comport with all university ethics regulations. So, what does that mean? That means that we don't engage in hacking. So, if there's some interesting information that we think is on a server somewhere, we're not then trying to figure out how to illicitly or illegally gain entry to it. It
Right.
means that if we ever work with a human subject, so someone comes and they say, hey, my device is infected, we have a short conversation with them, and we think, oh, yeah, this could be real, they have to come under a university ethics protocol before we
Mhm.
can do any further work with them. So we're able to do things open source. And I think one of the things that showcases is you can actually do an awful lot and
Yeah.
reveal an awful lot.
Yeah.
um, and there's that special 2% secret sauce, but that special 2% secret sauce, while important, isn't required, I think, to do high
Mhm.
quality work. The challenge is finding people who can do it and are interested in doing it at a university pay rate.
Yeah, oh no, I don't disagree with you. Obviously, my bias comes from having spent 32 years with the secret sauce. But as somebody who's now retired and no longer has access to the secret sauce, I also am relying on open source. But picking up on that a little bit, Chris, it seems to me that a lot of what you're doing is very, I don't know if complementary would be the term, very much in germane to what organizations like what CSE are trying to do as well. And full disclosure, the CSE I used to work for is a very different organization than one that functions right now. I worked there in the 80s and 90s, a very different time period. The fact that the Citizen Lab does not have a relationship, at least overtly, with organizations like CSE, is that a matter of principle, or is that just a matter of it doesn't come up and we don't want to complicate things?
Um, so, I mean, the word relationship is a little bit challenging. So, like, I know people at CSE. I like to think of some of them as professional colleagues. Um, we, as an organization, are distant from government and we are distant from private companies, and that's because we think it's critically important to maintain our independence. So,
Mhm.
I will speak with people from CSC from time to time, and I like to think that we have reasonably good relations. But we would be very hesitant to ever partner with any government organization because chances are pretty high that at some point we may want to turn around and critique them, and we need to
Right.
maintain that independence very, very
Yeah.
rigorously and carefully.
Oh, that makes a lot of sense. That makes a lot of sense. Chris, one last question. This is maybe a very generic one that may be a little bit hard to answer, but you know a lot more about digital threats than I do. What is it that keeps you up at night, and what should keep Canadians up at night in terms of where we are now, and if you can sort of look down a little bit down the pathway where we'll end up being in 6 months, 12 months, 2 years time? What is it that really concerns you?
So I guess at a high level, the thing that concerns me is, and this is really not being over the top. I think you could talk to anyone in my field, and they would be nodding rigorously. People don't understand that right now, as you and I are talking, we are in the middle of a dumpster fire. And we have been in the same dumpster fire that has just had more and more fuel added into it for the past 5 or 10 years. Computer security is terrible. Like,
How do you
you
really
know,
feel, Chris?
so it's, and there's a handful of things that computer security professionals have tried to do that work kind of well sometimes. So the fact that your devices get automatic updates is phenomenal. The fact that, we can sort of sometimes build strong encryption is great. And note the caveats there because they're real. Like, we have seen adversaries exploit update mechanisms to push state driven malware. We have
Yeah.
seen encryption be deployed poorly. So the math can be great, but the implementation, often falls down. But they exist. They are possibilities. The thing that keeps me up and that I worry about and that I, admittedly rail about some is that Western governments seem to have jumped on a bandwagon that we need to be able to go back to the early 2000s in terms of computer security and gaining access to ciphertext or to plain text. So right now, a huge volume of our communications are encrypted, right? So at the moment, you and I are chatting over an encrypted connection up to a server.
Right.
So it is essential that we maintain encryption, both in order to facilitate the integrity of conversation, so private individuals can talk, which matters, but also because the threat landscape is such that we are going to increasingly rely on end-to-end encryption, not just to have a private conversation, but so that our computers can communicate back and forth when the network appliances have been breached or vulnerable or deficient. And more to the point, we use encryption also to run what's called integrity checks to ensure that the website or the server you're communicating with is indeed and in fact the server or the individual in the message that has been sent or you've requested. So we
Right.
have seen the Canadian government, along with many of our partners, strongly come out and say, hey, encryption's fine. We love it. Best thing on earth. Hurrah, hurrah. And by the way, we need to have the lawful ability to gain access to plain text at any time. And by the way, service providers, that means that you need to configure your services such that when we come with a warrant, you can turn it over. And it's just a boneheaded way of going about things. It is politicians who don't realize that they are already burning alive in a dumpster fire, saying,
Mhm.
hey, we really think that these flame retardant clothes are important, but we just want everyone to take off, the hats and the gloves because, that part's fine. And they don't understand how bad things are. And, as soon as, Apple or Google or insert any of the big companies, as soon as they open these vulnerabilities, it isn't that they're all of a sudden going to like rush over to the Russian government and say, hey, we can help you out with your dissident problem. it's going to be that every Apple employee that has any relationship in any possible way with that decryption key is going to be one of the number one targets on every SIGINT and human
Yeah.
group in the world, to say nothing of the
Yeah.
criminals that will go after them. So
Yeah. Yeah.
the idea that we want to roll security back a decade and a half in the interests of it being easier for law enforcement when things just weren't well secured is just the wrong way of going. I think that there is an attitude or a misunderstanding of the way the judicial system operates in some fields, including in the Justice Department. And by that, I mean, people think that if you get a warrant, you get access to data. And that isn't the way a search warrant, as an example, works. When you receive a search warrant, you are permitted to breach or impede or intrude upon charter protected rights to try and do something. It isn't a requirement for that individual to say, oh, yes, the murder weapon. Well, you see, I hid it in my backyard and then I poured cement over it. So we just have to go there. And by the way, here's the shovel use. That's not the way it works. It means the police can show up, they can search, and if they find what they're looking for, congratulations, they got it. Now, does that mean that the police should just be told, well, faff off and you're just out of luck? No, we need to invest in a police force, in a security force that can deal with the kinds of threats that are becoming more prominent. And what that means, in part, is perhaps a little less time on the gun range and a little more time teaching digital forensics. So that has to be a professionalization change, but we can't treat security as an issue of this is inconvenient, so let's roll it back. Because sure, maybe the RCMP or CSIS or someone will be able to run a few more intercepts, but it'll also mean that everyone else is less secure. And we know that cybercrime is the fastest growing area of crime in North America. In rolling back security protections will just cause that to explode yet further, and without the investment we need in federal and provincial policing forces as well as security services to actually combat that very real ill and threat.
Yeah, I don't disagree with you, Chris. But as you're speaking, I'm thinking of the infamous San Bernardino attack back in 2015 in California, where the husband and wife team were killed, and the FBI got a hold of the phones, and they wanted to know if there were other attacks being planned in the area by accomplices of that couple. And of course, I think it was Apple at the time said, "Well, screw you, we can't give it to you," kind of thing. And I don't know I think they ended up paying a hacker to get into the phone and to make the determination that, in fact, there were no further attacks planned. So I do see both sides of the issue. I also want to comment that, I did work as a crypt analyst for a little while back in the late 80s, early 90s at CSE at a time when we were still actually breaking some code, none of which, of course, I can talk about. But I also recall a presentation being given in the early 90s by someone, a very brilliant mathematician, said that encryption is getting to the point where it is unbreakable. I mean, it's that sophisticated. So if it's that good, why isn't it more widely deployed?
Well, I think that we're seeing encryption being pretty widely deployed at this point. So that's one of the reasons it took a long time is it was computationally expensive, and as a result, the cloud providers and everyone else wanted to avoid it. At this point, the actual compute costs are pretty low. The other thing, I mentioned initially when I was talking about how bad everything was, I said that the encryption is often pretty good, but the implementation is often quite poor, right? And the San Bernardino case is a good example of that, right? So, I would just point out that Apple did provide a very high level of assistance. They just weren't willing to develop a whole new infrastructure to undermine the encryption of iPhones. But indeed, that was a case where the FBI and their associated partners had undertaken a series of activities that meant that Apple could not provide them with
Right.
information that was available in the Apple Cloud. So, and what was the result of that? Eventually, people got in. So I recognize that in some cases it is important to get access to data very quickly, and that is a strong desire, and I appreciate and understand that. But at the same time, what did that case show us? It showed us that law enforcement did indeed have a way of gaining access to that device and that data, and it did. B, through the court process, you saw that the FBI declined to disclose, or rather, I guess the Justice Department declined to disclose that they had these tools and capabilities. And more to the point, the FBI didn't go into their own technical offices to say, hey guys, do you have a way into this? So they turned it into this big political issue while not actually going through their own internal processes, which would have discovered that, oh, we can do this on our own. We don't need to
Hmm.
invent new massive vulnerabilities. We can do this. And indeed, Susan Landau just this week, who's a noted engineer who's worked on the crunchy bits of a lot of these technologies as well as the policy side and worked with lawyers, has recently demonstrated again that device access is not a particularly huge problem, especially if you're not talking about it. We need it this second, but we need it in the next, several months or a year, which is often the case of an evidentiary process, because these devices are upgraded and patched with such regularity, and they're often to patch vulnerabilities that any number of law enforcement vendors build malware for, build exploits for to bypass the encryption.
Hmm.
So the other difficulty in this debate is, what encryption are we talking about? Are we talking about the encryption from a device to a device, so a signal communication or WhatsApp communication? Are we talking about encryption on servers, which is a very different thing? Or are we talking about encryption on devices, which is yet another thing? And every one of those has unique and novel security properties. And quite often when we get into sort of a security debate, what I find is missing is a generalized application of encryption, when in fact it's very different. And as I'm sure that the crypto analyst that you were speaking to would have said that, like, yeah, the math is getting really good, but fortunately, engineering is still really bad.
Well, that's an interesting take on it. I remember walking away from that particular lecture thinking, "Wow!" If memory serves me correct, he said basically the encryption is getting so good that it would take all the computers in the world at the time. Obviously, this is a different time frame. They couldn't break a particular message, if they're given the history of the universe in terms of time frame to do it. But unfortunately, these systems are implemented by humans, and of course, we know humans are completely fallible. Chris, this has been a really interesting look into some quite fascinating work. As I'm listening to you, I'm thinking, wow, what a cool job it is that you have. I think the Citizen Lab is really a very interesting organization, and I kind of get a sneaking suspicion we might be talking again. But listen, thank you so much for taking the time to walk us through a bit of the stuff that you and your colleagues at the Citizen Lab are doing, and more importantly, what are things that average Canadians are thinking about. So I thank you for being on the program.
Thanks so much for having me.
So that was my conversation with Chris Parsons from the Citizens Lab. What do you think about what he had to say? Do you have the same concerns that he does? What should be the role of the state in terms of asking for access to our information under court warrants? Drop me a line. You can reach me on email, borealisrisk@gmail.com, or on Twitter @BorealisAge. You'll also find me on LinkedIn and Facebook. If you like the content, want to hear more, go to my website, borealisthreatrisk.com, hit the subscribe button, provide your email address. You get a free daily digest, all the podcasts, all the blogs, first thing every morning. I'd love to hear from you, what you thought about this podcast and others. I'll talk to you again soon. Until then, stay safe.